Deanne's also got the PowerPoint so she can keep it going and keep it moving on her end if something happens on this end. But as Deanne said, I'm a detective with the Austin Police Department. I've been with Austin for 19 years, and I've been specifically assigned to DWI for the last 11. And so kind of what each agency is different and kind of what their perspectives are and what each agency is doing. And a lot of it really boils down to what their capabilities are. In Austin, we've kind of been over probably the last since 1998, so a couple of decades now, have really been focused on DWI enforcement. It's something that we saw years ago back in 1998, being the live music capital that Texas, that we have here in Austin, that they claim to be. Where you guys at probably have a lot of it too, but we kind of named it here, so we're owning it. So what we have with that is we have downtown, we have 6th Street, we have bar areas, and a lot of other things out there that kind of kick this stuff off. But what we've seen over the last probably decade is kind of the spread of different areas of Austin that added to a lot of the intoxication issues and things that we had. We have some other areas that have bar districts and things like that. One of the huge things that we have seen in the last decade since I got into DWI enforcement is the increase in drug driving. Every state's a little bit different in what they call it. And also too, every state's a little bit different in the term DUI or DWI. So depending on where you're at, where you're located, that's a little bit, it's kind of the same thing, but a little bit different. So DWI in the state of Texas is basically driving while intoxicated. And that covers any kind of intoxication, whether it be alcohol intoxication or drug intoxication. And I'll go into a little bit more of that, the definition of that here in a minute. But every state has a different term. And a lot of states now are using DUI, driving under the influence. And it's kind of the same thing. The same elements of the offense exist. But you'll hear me refer to DWI because that's what our law is here in Texas. But back in 1998, when we started looking around and we saw a lot of the issues that we were having, traffic fatalities and serious injury crashes and things like that, we have the bean counters like every agency does that kind of looks into the reasonings behind those. And they started to see the amount that were due to drugs and alcohol. Back then, more alcohol than it was drugs. But as a department, we looked at that and said, what can we do to start combating that? So they came up with the DWI back in 1998. And this screen here is basically the mission that we were given in Austin, but also every agency that has a DWI enforcement or traffic enforcement division or agencies that focus on traffic enforcement, this is their ultimate goal. They may spell it out in different ways, they may type it out in different ways, but this is primarily the mission that we have. So this is what we were given. And it was basically to reduce fatalities, injuries, and loss of property due to DWI crashes within their jurisdiction. For us, on average, in a given year, we're about 30 to 40% of the crashes the fatality crashes that we have within the city of Austin are due to drugs and alcohol. We have some years that are a little bit lower, some a little bit higher, but on average, we're in the high 30% of our fatalities are due to drugs or alcohol. And so that's what we're trying to combat and figure out. And so we do that, number one, through proactive enforcement of DWI laws. In the state of Texas, you will not find a more proactive department when it comes to DWI enforcement, at least right now. On average, in the city, we do between 5,000 and 6,000 DWI arrests a year just for the city of Austin. That's not the other entities encompassed within the same county, but just the city of Austin, between 5,000 and 6,000 DWI arrests per year is what we're doing. So we have a lot of enforcement. All of our officers are trained to do DWI and make DWI arrests. But having a specialized unit allows us a lot more ability, especially on those serious cases where we can come in and do a lot more for them. We also provide training and education to officers, other law enforcement agencies, and the public. So I teach all of the Austin officers when it comes to DWI enforcement. We take them for an entire week and teach them how to do DWI enforcement. Then we also, I do all the recurring training for them, for the field sobriety tests and those kind of things. I've been blessed enough to teach across the country and across the state at a ton of different things. So, and that's usually officers or prosecutors or those kind of things. But one of the things, that last thing we mentioned there is the public. I try to do as much of what I'm doing today as I can with people that are not within the law enforcement community, because what we have found out, even with the proactive enforcement of DWI laws that we have, we cannot arrest our way out of this issue. DWI is a decision that is made to either take in drugs or alcohol and then get behind the wheel of a car and then drive. And unfortunately, employers, they bear the burden of that responsibility when it's some employee that they have, because you guys know y'all are going to have to deal with it, and maybe the ones that end up having to go through litigation over it. So a lot of people don't, I think they realize it, but a lot of times they don't understand that this crime, DWI or DUI, wherever you're at, is 100% preventable, because it's based on a decision that a person makes to get behind the wheel. Now, I don't believe that everybody goes and drinks or does some drug and says, you know what, I'm going to go kill somebody and get behind the wheel of a car. I don't think that's their intent. But I do think that it's a decision that's made, and that I'm out at a bar, whatever, I'm supposed to be the designated driver. That didn't happen. So now I'm going to drive, and then we end up getting people injured or killed due to it. So that's a lot of the training and education that I do, is I really try to touch on the public aspect of it as much as I can, because I do feel that we need your help in this. We need the public to stand up and say enough's enough. You know, and whatever state you're in, there's different ways to do that through legislation, those kind of things. But that's what we really try to do through there. And then lastly, for us here in Austin, and most agencies that have a DWI enforcement unit are doing this, they provide the support to control by reducing the time spent processing a DWI arrest. So a lot of people don't realize DWI here in the state of Texas, your first offense and second offense also are misdemeanors. One's a Class B and one's a Class A. Class B is like a step above a ticket here in Texas. You do go to jail for it, but the penalties are a little bit different and those kind of things. But that misdemeanor arrest, it can take an officer literally 4 to 5 hours to process that one arrest. There are two aspects to a DWI arrest. Number one, you have the civil side of it, which is your license suspension that's going to be implemented right then. And then you also have the criminal side, which is the criminal charges that you're going to have to deal with later on in court. So because there's two sides to that, there's a civil and a criminal side, you're going to have a lot more paperwork. So the civil side actually does a lot more paperwork than the criminal side does. So on DWIs, those arrests take a long time because of the amount of paperwork that goes into it. Also, officers have found over the years that if there's any arrest that you're going to go to court on, it's going to be a DWI arrest. So they try to do a really, really good job, knowing that you may be cross-examined by a defense attorney at some point on this case. So we try to put a little bit more effort and time into it. And then each agency is a little bit different. Some have more training than others when it comes to that aspect of the report writing and so those kind of things. But that's what one of our goals is to really spend the time processing those and taking those away from patrol so they can go back to doing what it is that patrol does. Also, I might have forgot to mention, if you do have questions, send them over to Deanne. I told her just to, if it's one that pertains to the slide I'm on, I can handle it right then. You're not going to throw me off with it. If it's one that she feels I can wait, then I'll catch you at the end, okay? So some of the law enforcement efforts, and you may have heard of these, each state may have a different name for it, but these are some of the things that we do to combat DWI. So number one is no refusal initiative. So I think that term kind of goes across state lines as to what we're doing on those. But I'll kind of explain a little bit for those of you that aren't familiar with no refusal initiative, or you've heard that term and you're like, well, what is that? So by driving on the roadways, and I'm going to talk about Texas, but every state has pretty much the same thing and it's working the same way. They have different names for it, but they work the same way. But by driving on the roadways in the state of Texas, you have already agreed to give us a sample of breath or blood if you're arrested for DWI. And in the state of Texas, that's actually found in Chapter 724 of the Texas Transportation Code, and it's called implied consent. It has nothing to do with you having a license. It has nothing to do with you being in the state that you're in legally or any of that kind of stuff. By driving on the roadways, that is considered a right. It's not a privilege to drive. I'm sorry, it's a privilege, not a right to drive. So it's a privilege that the state is giving you to drive on the roadways in the state of Texas. So if you're driving on the roadways in the state of Texas, you're already deemed to have given consent for breath or blood if you're arrested for DWI. So during a no refusal initiative, and this is how we work here, and most states are the same way. If it is some of them do it all the time, 24/7. Some of them do it on weekends and holidays and those kind of things. We actually opt to do more of the weekends and holidays things. Our administration feels that it's a little more impactful as far as messaging goes. But if you're arrested for DWI, we're going to read you a form here in Texas called the DIC-24. But what it's doing is informing you of the consequences of not giving us that sample that you said you're going to give us by driving on the roadways. So if you basically withdraw your consent for that sample at that time, during a no refusal initiative, what we will do is we'll draft a warrant. and it's a blood search warrant. So what we do is we go to a judge. Here in Austin, we have it 24/7. Some agencies do it via Zoom or Skype or whatever, depending on the laws that you have where you're at. But here in Austin, we have a magistrate down at the jail 24/7. So what we do is we draft a search warrant, and we go before the judge and we say, hey, here are the facts of the case. Here's what we have, and here's what we observed, and here's why we believe they're intoxicated, and present that to a judge directly. If a judge decides that we have probable cause to believe that the evidence is there, then they'll issue that search warrant. So just like if you have a search warrant for a house or a search warrant for a car, this is the exact same thing, other than the evidence is not located in the car or in your house, it's located within your body. So the search warrant actually allows us and gives us the permission to go in and take the blood, because that's where the evidence of the crime is held in the DWI. We're looking for intoxication, and that's where the evidence is within your blood. So that's kind of how the no refusal initiative works. Each one, again, states a little bit different how they do it, when they do it, and those kind of things, but that's how it works. So if the search warrant's granted, we execute the search warrant. With us, we actually take 2 blood vials. One of them is for us to have tested. The other is we'll hold on to it. So you're later on, defense attorneys, whoever wants to come get it, and they can have it retested if they want to. And that's how we work with those. It's been impactful in a lot of different ways. A lot of it really is, the goal of no refusal is not to basically, it's to provide all the evidence we can, but it's really not to get more arrests. The goal of no refusal actually is to prevent people from doing it. I've been out before to dinner during no refusal. I'll go out or whatever, and I have a polo shirt on that says DWI enforcement on it. And I'll have people walk up to me and they say, hey, is it no refusal this weekend? Yeah, it is. Okay, well, I'm going to do better this weekend. So those are the kind of things that we get sometimes from people, and we're kind of like, well, if that worked, it worked. So ultimately, that's our goal. And a lot of it, too, is really the ultimate goal of all these things that I'm talking about, the law enforcement efforts, is to eliminate drunk driving. So if they ever came to me, and I've told people this in media interviews and everything that I've done, if they ever came to me and said, Mike, you know what, there are not enough DWI arrests to support what you guys are doing. We're going to have to send you back to this unit or some other unit or disband or whatever we're doing. If that was the reason they said they were doing it is because we don't have enough, then that's exactly what we set out to do. If they ever came to me and said, you know what, it's just not there anymore, then that's exactly what we set out to do. So us having low numbers is that's not something that I get hurt about by any means. So that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. I'm going to rush through this real quick, but you guys can read it. So saturation patrols, agencies will put different officers in different areas. Directed patrols, if they have bar districts, a lot of times they'll put them down there. DWI, DUI checkpoints, we do not have those in the state of Texas and probably never will. Certain states have them and they've been really successful. It just really depends on the state and how the legislation works. And a lot of times there are rules associated with checkpoints for those states that do have them, but we don't have them here in the state of Texas. But those are some of the things that agencies are doing. We do public safety and media announcements, and then public education and awareness. All that is a lot of times done through TxDOT, our Department of Transportation here, that we work with to get that messaging out. During no refusal initiatives, I announce it. We put it out there in the media that we're doing it. And again, it's to get people to make other choices. It's not to get numbers up or anything like that. It's to get them so we don't have to have DWI arrest and fatality. All right, let's talk a little bit about the definition of intoxication. And this is for the state of Texas. Most states have some sort of intoxication definition, very similar. How they write it is a little bit different, but it just really depends. And those states that have legalized marijuana, they actually have different things written for that too. Some have a permissible inference, a 5 nanogram THC kind of thing. It really kind of depends on the state. But in the state of Texas, this is the definition of intoxication. So it's not having the normal use of mental and physical faculties by reason of the introduction of alcohol, a controlled substance, a drug, a dangerous drug, a combination of 2 or more of those substances, or any other substance into the body, semicolon, let's stop there. So this definition, as you can see, is a 2-pronged definition. So what we really, really, really try to get across to people is that whole first part of that definition, if you look at it, is basically anything that you can put into your body that causes you to lose the normal use of mental or physical faculty. So there are things out there that, although it's a legal substance and you're allowed to have it, if you put it in your body and it causes you to lose the normal use of mental or physical faculties, you can be arrested for DWI. So as employers, and what a lot of the things that you guys have to look out for is if you have employees that even if they're on certain medications, they have to be real careful whether they're driving and taking one of your cars out, whatever they're doing. because there are a lot of medications that'll do that, and not all of them. And a lot of times, if people take the medication the way it's supposed to be taken, it's not an issue. But if you have certain, a lot of people, if they're on Xanax and they're taking too much Xanax, Xanax is a CNS depressant. I'll go through drug categories in a little bit, but it can cause that intoxication, and it can cause a loss of normal use of mental or physical faculties. So you got to be really, really careful with that. This definition talks about illegal substances, but it also talks about those that you can have. We have made arrests for people on Ambien before, which is a sleep aid. If you take an Ambien and then go drive, that's a problem. And that's some of the stuff that we run into. Even though you're allowed to have that, it's not something illegal to have. And it's prescribed to you. You got to be real, real careful with it. So what we really try to get across to people is that if you're taking medications and those kind of things, you just got to be really careful with what you're doing, because you can be arrested for DWI. So that's the first part of the definition. The second part is the one that everybody knows, is having an alcohol concentration of 0.08 or more. And that 0.08 number right now, as it stands right now, is the illegal per se across the entire country. There is a push through legislation to lower that to 0.05. I don't know if you guys have seen, but Utah and some of these other states have done that, where they've gone to 0.05. I'm not sure how it's working out for them, because I think there's some challenges there, but that's just me. But those are some of the things that are out there too, is to try to lower that number from 0.08, from 0.08 to 0.05. Texas was the last one to go to 0.08, and it's because the feds finally came. We were 0.10. The feds finally came in and said, "Hey, we're going to pull your highway dollars." And Texas said, "Oh, well, we did 0.08 yesterday. Didn't hear about it." So that we were the last ones to do that. But that's the definition of intoxication in Texas. And this is just kind of a blood alcohol correlation. This was put out by NHTSA a few years ago. So I think a lot of people, they don't really understand how things correlate when it comes to those numbers. So if you look at those numbers on the far left, you have 0.02, 0.05, 0.08, 10, and 15. And then in the middle, you basically have some of the effects at those lower numbers. So let's look at 0.02. So a lot of people think that 0.02, that is not any effect at all, shouldn't be a big deal. Well, some of the stuff that they saw through the studies they did is you already start to see a loss of judgment, because that's the first thing that starts to be affected by alcohol or drug, depending on the type of drug. Some slight body warmth, those kind of things. So you can read through there, and I'm okay with the analyst to share this with you guys later, so you can take a look at it, since we're having to kind of rush through some of it. But those are all things when you correlate numbers to the things that your body is doing. So before you get to a 0.08, which is the third one down, you have those other two above it, the 0.02, the 0.05, and all the other numbers in between. If you go back to that definition of intoxication that I just provided a little bit ago, a lot of people don't think that you can be arrested for DWI below a 0.08, but you can. Because if you fall under that first part of that definition, having lost normal use of mental and physical faculties due to the introduction of all that stuff I read, if it causes you to lose normal use of those faculties, then you can be arrested for DWI. So if you take, for example, somebody that never ever drinks, and they go and they do drink that one night or whatever, they are going to be below a 0.08 and will probably lose normal use of mental and physical faculties. And so they can be arrested for DWI. So this is just a quick correlation for you guys to look at some of the things you can see from lower BACs. Now we're going to kind of get into the drug aspect of it a little bit deeper. I won't spend a lot of time on this part. This is just the definition, but this definition was developed by the Drug Evaluation Classification Program. And it says a drug is any substance that when taken into the human body can impair the ability to operate a motor vehicle safely. So if you kind of go back to what we were talking about with the definition of intoxication, same thing. Any drug that you can take into the body that can impair you is what a drug is identified as. Alcohol is actually a drug. It falls in the CNS depressant category, and I'll show you those categories here in just a second. But it's a lot of what we deal with is the drug driving stuff. Here at Austin, all of the guys, or the officers that are on the DWI unit in Austin, are certified as DREs, and that's what's the acronym is a drug recognition expert. So what those officers are trained to do is to evaluate a person and determine what drug category is impairing that person. So these are the 7 drug categories, and this does not include synthetics, because those are a whole different ball of wax right now. But these are the 7 drug categories. You have CNS depressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, dissociative anesthetics, narcotic analgesics, inhalants, and then cannabis. And out to the right, you see a little bit of just a quick snapshot of what some of those are by street names sometimes and different things in there. So depressants, which alcohol falls into, is the Xanax, Valium, Ambien stuff. Stimulants would be your cocaine and your methamphetamine, hallucinogens, LSD, those things. So you can see that. But those are the 7 drug categories. And then you have the wild card in there that I didn't put, that is synthetics. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a minute. So a lot of people want to know why there is not an illegal per se for drugs. An illegal per se being a hard number when it comes to drugs, just like we have with alcohol. We have a 0.08 for alcohol. Why can't we have a 5 nanograms THC thing, any of that kind of stuff for marijuana and all these other drugs? So this is why. Alcohol is very linear. We understand alcohol. There have been tons of studies on alcohol. And for most people, it has the same effect at the same numbers and those kind of things. There will be some variances in there in their tolerance, because you do have tolerance that you can build up. But BAC-wise and number-wise, alcohol is very linear. So if we have some facts about you as a person, body weight and those kind of things, and absorption, all those, we can kind of keep an eye on what alcohol is doing in your body, so we can actually go back and trial. So if I have somebody blow or provide a breath of blood sample at a 0.09, but that was 3 hours after the crash, we can do what's called retrograde extrapolation, and we can take that scientifically, they can take that number back and kind of pin down what your number was alcohol-wise. Drug-wise, we cannot do that. Number one, there's a lack of studies with tons of drugs. We can't go into a room, because a lot of drugs are outlawed. We can't go into a room and throw down a handful of cocaine and say, okay, snort until we tell you to stop, and then we're going to go ahead and evaluate you and do tests on you. So we can't do that. And a lot of drugs are like that. We just don't have the ability to go in and do that kind of thing. Choices of absorption. So alcohol, typically, the only way you're taking alcohol is drinking it. There are some other ways out there now that I won't get into. But drinking alcohol is your main way of absorption. Well, when it comes to drugs, you can inject them, you can snort them, you can smoke them, you can eat them. There's a lot of different ways to take in a drug. So how you take that into your body really affects the absorption, how it goes through your body. So those are some of the deals we're dealing with. Many drugs are not water soluble like alcohol is. Marijuana is actually fat soluble. So there are different things there that we have to worry about. Every drug combination and type varies. So if you have certain drugs, heroin and some of the other ones that are made, their potency is different. So there's just a lot of different things that work with drugs when it comes to coming up with a number. Elimination is done by half-life, not metabolization through the body. And so there's just a lot of things. So that's why there's not numbers. We've had a lot of people say that, Colorado came up with the 5 nanograms THC permissible inference thing. I understand why they did it, but in a lot of ways, you can't really do it. It's not that simple when it comes to a lot of the other drugs. They felt like they had enough studies into marijuana stuff that they could do that, but there's a lot that they can't. Just real quick, now you guys have probably seen this in different things, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but these are just some of the synthetics. You have bath salts, and that's not the kind of bath salts you take a bath with. That's just the term that was applied to these here. So there's been a lot in the news about them. We saw an incline, but we see them typically, but not a lot in driving. But we have had a lot of calls about them. Most of the people that are on these bath salts, I'm not even sure they can find their car if they tried to. Now, if they were driving and then took them, then we might see that more. But these are just some of the things that we're starting to see. So you have bath salts. K2, I'm sure you've heard of that. It's a synthetic cannabinoid. And so one of the things, when I sat down with our lab here at Austin, we really talked about the differences and kind of what they saw with these things. One of the things that our lab and most labs want people to understand is that this is not marijuana. It's chemical. And typically what they do is they take some sort of potpourri or some sort of binding, something to hold the chemical on there, the plant, and then they spray a chemical onto it. So it's not what people think it is. And I think a lot of times people hear that term fake marijuana or synthetic marijuana or any of that kind of stuff, and they feel like since it's man-made, it's easier or better. That's absolutely not the case. This is a whole different thing, and it has a lot of different effects. And if you see what they were trying to do is get the effect of marijuana without it being marijuana. And there's some different things out there with it, but you got to be real careful with this. And we see a lot of it. Most common symptoms of somebody that's on one of synthetics: hypertension, tachycardia, agitation, vomiting, hallucination, psychosis, seizures, and panic attack. The ones that we have seen have been pretty extreme. We see a lot of the little more violence out of those groups there that we've run into. Real quickly, I'm going to talk about marijuana. And you guys have seen a lot in the news and all that kind of thing, but this is kind of a breakdown of it in a blood test and what we see. We see some different things when that comes back. You have the Delta-9 And then you have the metabolites of it, which are the 11 hydroxys and then the carboxy THCs and those kind of things. So when we get a blood test back and it's got marijuana metabolites in it and those kind of things, that's what we have to look at as law enforcement to say, how recent is it? The Delta-9 is the more recent one typically. We have gotten some blood tests back that say the straight THC, it hadn't even started to break down yet, but these are the metabolites of it. And just kind of give you an idea of what we look at. Dan, how are we doing on time?
You are doing good. I mean, it's 10:30, so I think we had until about 10:30, but I think this is interesting.
Okay, if you guys want to stick with me, feel free. You will not hurt my feelings if you got to go. I promise you. So don't worry about that. So let's talk a little bit how marijuana works in the body. So number one, it's ingested. What they're starting to see too is that it combines quickly, and then the impairment peaks quickly, and then starts to level out, and then THC crosses the brain-blood barrier or blood-brain barrier. So one of the things that we've started to find with it in our testing is the blood test that we get back may actually not be the accurate number of what's in that person's body. Because when we test it, we're getting your blood. Well, a lot of what they're finding, because marijuana is fat soluble, there's a lot of it in the brain. And so it moves back and forth a little bit. So as law enforcement, those numbers that we're getting on blood tests, we're having to do some studies into that to see what we're actually getting out of that. Because marijuana just crosses over and does different things. So it just really depends. It really depends on the person too. It's like with alcohol, there's a tolerance that can be built up. And so we're having to really keep an eye on that. Just some of the things that they've seen in different studies, they have seen continued psychomotor impairment after 3 weeks of abstinence in chronic frequent users, suggesting the ability to drive is impaired at the time of these low blood THC concentrations. So these are just some of the studies that started to come out when they started legalizing, and we're going to see some more things come out. I'm just going to go through these real quick. One of the things that we do see is that marijuana typically is more of a mental impairment thing that we've started to see. We do see the physical impairment side of it, but before that, we typically see the mental impairment in marijuana. So when we're doing drug evaluations, the DRE evaluations I've talked about, when we get down to the jail and we start doing evaluations, we see with marijuana a lot of the more mental type clues and signs and symptoms that we start to see with them. There are some physical indicators too. I'm going to show you guys this matrix here at the end that we operate off of. So you're going to see some different things, but with marijuana, we see a lot more of the mental impairment come across. Just some of the effects that we see on it. Decision making, your ability to visually search and scan in front of you is impaired. So if you look at driving, it is the ultimate in psychomotor, basically physical dividing your attention task. And so what we start to see is if you're not able to divide your attention because you start to lose that mental ability a little bit, it's impaired. So when you can't judge distances and speeds and those kind of things like you should be able to, that all causes issue. And that's where a lot of the driving issues come in with marijuana and other drugs. They all have some sort of effect. But this is what you start to see is the ability to process information has changed, and your reaction to what you're processing is what changes too. Some of the potencies that we're starting to see, and you guys have probably seen this kind of graph somewhere else. I think those states that have done legalization and those kind of things, they really need to pay attention to potencies and what goes on with that. Back in 1980, when Willie Nelson kind of started the whole weed thing, everything was pretty low, 4%, those kind of things. And you can see here how it's going up. They have some extracts and concentrates. I think I've got some pictures later on in here that show some of the things they're pulling out of these, but now we're getting upwards of 90%, sometimes over THC level. So that's one of the things that we're really having to combat now too, is explaining to people that the marijuana you're smoking is not necessarily what it was back in the day. So a lot of people, when we talk about that, a lot of people say, oh, it's just a plant, marijuana is pretty harmless. Well, the things that we've started to find is those states that have done legalization, this is the stuff that comes in behind it. And these are just some different examples of things that they see. And these are the more high concentrate THCs. These are the things they're able to extract out of that plant, typically through heat, and to start to get the oils out of it. So the oils are going to have the higher concentrations, and that's what I'm showing you here is just some of the examples of things that we've seen. Some other examples of concentrated THCs. You got the vape pens now. There's some more pictures of that. And then edibles. Edibles is huge thing. We're starting to see a ton of that here. And I promise you, if you put those little Reese's peanut butter cup looking things in front of my kids, they're not going to break. They're not going to just stop at one. They're going all in. So a lot of what they're starting to see with the edibles is packaging and how they do that. I mean, those little Kit Kats down there at the bottom look pretty dang good. And I don't know that if you put them in front of a lot of people, they'd really pay attention to what it was. So they're really having to change their packaging and focus on that right now because it was really kind of geared toward kids in a lot of ways. And I'll show you some other stuff in a second. Just as some other examples of buying vape pens and those kind of things on Groupon, different things that you see. As employers, and you guys, as you see people come in and out with vape pens and those kind of things, I'm not saying that everybody smoking those vape pens has one of these, but really pay attention. You know, you got to be real careful with that. The stuff that they're able to do while they're driving or while they're at work and that kind of thing and get away with has been, it's a lot of it's pretty good. You know, and it's very discreet and it kind of fills in with everything else. So that's a lot of what we see. But this is a Groupon that we found. Just some other ones too. Some examples out there of vape pens and things. Those gummy bears, those peach rings. Those are actually marijuana peach rings. So just different things that you see there. I can't believe it's pot butter. Get some of that stuff in there. And then just some different things. This was a weird one that they found a while back. Suppositories. They've now figured out how to put cannabis in. Some of the other stuff we've seen. Now this guy here, it shows you some of the packaging and some of the different things that are out there. So this is a cookie. It's a chocolate chip cookie. And if you read at the very top up there, it says 6.5 servings. And it has 65 milligrams of active THC. I promise you, if you put that cookie in front of my fat ass sometime, I would not just eat a fifth of that cookie and break that down, or a sixth of that cookie. So that's a lot of the danger in these things, in the edibles, is the amounts. Most people would not just break off a piece of that cookie and eat that. It would be the entire thing. And so that's what we're really trying to be careful with the edibles too. But we see a lot of overdosing on edibles. It typically doesn't kill them, but it definitely causes some major medical issues that we see, and they end up having to go to the hospital a lot of times. Just real quick, and I'm getting toward the end here. So if you have questions, start sending them in, and I'll try to handle those here in a little bit. Some of the drug screening issues that we have, a lot of you employers, if you're doing blood testing and those kind of things, just some issues you may run into. And depending on what labs and things you're using, synthetics are really difficult to detect, and most labs cannot do it. We actually have a couple different labs we use. The main one is NMS Labs up in Pennsylvania that we send our stuff off to, and they've actually gotten really good with synthetics, but it's a moving target with synthetics. They're constantly moving and changing what they're doing, and the chemical composition, those kind of things. So we're really having to, they stay up on it really well, and we utilize them as much as we possibly can. So synthetics are really difficult to detect. The other one is inhalants. So if you see that bottle down there on the bottom, that is dust off. And I promise you, probably every office that I've ever been into has got that. That is one of the biggest inhalant abuse things that we see, is that dust off stuff, because it affects you really quick, and it goes away really quick. I'll kind of give you a background story here at Austin PD. We had a sergeant over a detective unit here at Austin that had been going through some issues at home and different things. And while at work, got hooked on this dust off. And so 2 DWI arrests later from dust off and inhalants. He ends up dying, surrounded by cans of these things because of his addiction to this stuff. He's been fired and lost his job since then and all that before he died. But these are things that are readily available in every office around there. And one of the biggest abuse things that we see too, like I said, it wears off really quick. So what it's doing when you inhale that is it's cutting off the circulation to your brain. It's moving, it's taking out the oxygen out of your brain. And that's where the high comes from so fast. But as soon as oxygen starts to come in, it comes back quick. But it's also one of those that the first time you ever do it can kill you with the inhalant. So you got to be real careful with it. But those are screening issues. So a lot of times when I talk about this, even if we got a blood test back on somebody that had been on an inhalant, typically we're not going to see that. So those are some of the screening issues we have there. Just some things to think about, specifically with marijuana, but all these drugs that we talk about. The science is relatively new, even on marijuana. I know it's been going probably since the last decade or so, but it's changing a lot. and a lot of the science that we see is biased. On both sides of it, there's probably some biased science, but there's a lot that we don't know about it still and what it's doing. And then a lot of the way it's being developed and manufactured and those kind of things, they're trying to get a handle on too, but those things are shifting. But when it comes to any of these drugs, there's a lot of things that are changing. As a DRE, when we have to go to recertification every 2 years, and we talk about the new and emerging things, and it'll blow you away, the stuff that changes and the ways they find to do different things. Drug driving has definitely been on the incline, and I don't see that it's going away at all, because there's just so many different changes to it. Just some technologies that are out there that are actually, court system uses some of these when it comes to alcohol detection. We actually have I've had employers call me before asking about different solutions and things that they can do if they have somebody that they're trying to monitor. So these are just some different devices that do that. This is called a scram device, and what it does is it has a chemical that detects alcohol. So the person wears it. Basically, they wear it like an ankle bracelet or whatever it is, and it's constantly monitoring them. And they can actually set that up where it will report to you if it ends up triggering, those kind of things. Ignition interlocks, probably everybody's seen one of these. A lot of times these get installed on cars. After you have a DWI arrest, you have to have this installed and then pay for that. So that's an ignition interlock. If you have an employee and they're having to blow into this to start their car, then they have had a DWI most likely. Then you have a PAM device, a portable alcohol monitor, which you can, if you have employers, we have had employers call us about this one, that basically they have people that they require to submit to one of these, either through the disciplinary issues or anything like that. But we have this one too, and it's more of a portable one, a little more discreet, not wearing an ankle monitor, that kind of thing. And real quick, I'm just going to talk about the drug evaluation process that we do as DREs, and then I think that'll end it, and then we can do questions. So when we do the DRE evaluations, it's a 12-step process that we're trained to do. And the DREs, unlike a lot of classes in law enforcement and in other walks of life, you show up and you get you get your certificate and you're done. This is not one of those classes, I promise you that. This one was an entire month. You do 2 weeks of classroom exams and learning and exams and those kind of things. And then we spent the next 2 to 3 weeks down at a jail. Mine was in San Antonio when I got certified. And what you do is you pair up and you go down to the jail in San Antonio at night and you watch people. Well, if you feel like somebody is high or intoxicated on drugs or anything like that, you pull them out of the crowd, you offer them, give them an extra phone call and a cookie or whatever it is, and you ask them if you can do evaluations on them. It doesn't affect them criminally or anything like that. We're not reporting what we see, any of that kind of thing. But what we're doing is we're doing hands-on evaluations of these people. And we have to actually do an evaluation and make a call on what they're impaired on, what drug category it is that's doing the impairing on that. The instructor actually takes a urinalysis test beforehand, and we don't know the answer to that. And they actually don't even tell us afterward. They just tell us whether we passed or not. But they take a urinalysis on the person, so they know what the drug category is that's in there, and then we continue from there. So that's how we learn to do that, and it's a little over a month-long process to become a DRE. But during the evaluation process, we do these are the steps we follow to do that. Number one, we take a breath alcohol test. We want to make sure that alcohol is not the impairing substance before we do a DRE evaluation. That's why we do that test, just to be sure. Then we've got these things that we do and walk through it. I won't spend time on every single one of them, but again, it's just kind of walking through what we're doing. A lot of the same things that we do during the field sobriety tests on the street, the eyes, which is the horizontal gaze and nystagmus, the walk and turn, the one-leg stand test, and then a bunch of different things that we do too. We take a lot of vital signs because a lot of drug categories actually will raise your body temperature. They will raise your blood pressure or lower your blood pressure. So there's different vital signs that we can see. And by looking at those, we can determine, that'll help us determine what drug category that person is on as well. This is I told you, this is kind of a matrix that we use. And what this does is this walks us through each of the 7. So if you look at the top of that matrix, underneath all the dots, but the top of the little chart there, it says CNS suppressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, and names all those off. So those are the 7 drug categories. Off to the left are the signs and symptoms and different things that we will see from each of those drug categories. So as DREs, we're trained to look at this, recreate this actually for testing. But we look at each of these DRE evaluations that we do, and we basically go off this list and say, okay, did we see horizontal gaze and nystagmus, which if you guys haven't seen that, it's an involuntary jerking of the eyes as the eyes gaze toward the side, and it's caused by certain drugs. So it'll show you like CNS depressants that exist with those and different things. So what this is kind of doing is walking through the different things that we'll see from each one. If you look at narcotic analgesic, that's fourth line down where it says pupil size, under narcotic analgesic, it's the only one that causes constricted pupils. So if you ever see somebody and they're taking pain medications, painkillers, or any of those kind of things along the line of the same drug category as heroin is what narcotic analgesic is. But you see these real pinpoint pupils. That's one of the signs and symptoms that it's narcotic analgesic is coming through there. And then this is just some of the signs and symptoms that you would see as an employer that you would look at if you saw certain things by not doing blood pressure and those kind of things, but just by watching them, some of the signs and symptoms you might see on different drug categories. A lot of them they have the same types of deals, or some of them a little more specific to certain categories. But these are some things we're doing. And then the amount of time that is in your system can vary as well. So if you look at that second category down, duration of effects, then you start looking at some of that. I mean, you got barbiturates down there, which is 1 to 16 hours. I mean, that's a pretty big gap. And then you got cocaine, 5 to 90 minutes, depending on how long ago they took it. So there's just a lot of things in there, a lot of information there. And I'm gonna let Deanne, if she has questions that pertain more to employers, because I deal with this side of it. But some of the things that I recommend for you guys as employers is training for supervisors and employees on warning signs. So when you see things, and a lot of companies have this now where they've implemented policies and procedures and on how people can get help and things to look for and those kind of things, make sure that you do training for those kind of things. I would implement policies and procedures regarding drugs and alcohol to protect yourselves. If those aren't in there, then I feel like you really open yourself up to a lot of litigation and issues, especially if you have a company where people are driving around. We dealt with one of those just the other day where an employee crashed into somebody and took off from the scene. We caught them and did all that, but it's caused a lot of issues for that specific employee or that employer. And then you have the others here that utilize the employees assistance programs if you have them, and then drug and screening programs if you have those as well. And those are just some of the things that we've seen employers talk about and call us with questions on. It's just how you protect yourself as employers. Here's my information. If you guys need to email me or ever have any questions, feel free to do so. Again, this is a lot of what I really like to be able to do is talk to the public about this stuff. And I know this is very brief, kind of a crash course kind of deal and some drug and alcohol issues and things like that. But by all means, if you need to reach out to me for anything, please do.
All right. Well, thank you, Officer Jennings. There was a couple of questions from,
okay.
Law enforcement perspective. Can you kind of just give an overall estimate of the cost of the DWI?
I'm sorry, you cut out. Is the cost of what?
Of a DWI, what would be the cost of a DWI?
Oh, for the defendant. So on average, the studies that are out there that they normally say between 17,000 is kind of your baseline if you go to trial on it, that kind of thing. But it's also too taking into account the license suspension issues and all those kind of things that come along with it. On average, it's 17 to 20,000. There are some attorneys here in Austin specifically that just to talk to them might cost you that much. But on average, I think they say about 17,000 is the base. And that's dealing with license suspension issues, and that's dealing with court costs and all the other fines and things that go along with it. If you do end up getting an alcohol interlock, one of the IED or IID devices installed in your car, that's going to cost you monthly as well, because you're going to have to pay for monitoring on that, and then you have to pay for the downloads and those kind of things. So it is absolutely really expensive. And they put out a lot of actually ad campaigns on that. If you go to NHTSA.gov, they have some drunk driving ads and things like that they put out there dealing with specifics of the cost of it and what all that ran, and then having to go through the classes. And even if you get probation on these on a first time DWI, the amount of classes and hoops that you have to jump through are pretty high.
Okay. We did have someone asked if edibles were legal in Texas. And if they're not, do you foresee that coming in the future?
Are they legal now?
Right.
Yeah, no, right now they're not, but I will say this, that my personal opinion is I think that we will start to see the push toward legalization. We're already starting to see the push. I do think they will end up being legalized here. The marijuana will eventually. I think the states that have it, they have dealt with a lot of issues, but I don't think that people want to hear about a lot of the issues that they are dealing with. If you talk to Colorado prosecutors and law enforcement, those guys, um, they will tell you that a lot of the driving issues that they're starting to see, they have a lot more serious injury crashes now. And I don't know fatality numbers, but their crash rates are going up. And so I think a lot of it, I'm definitely, I see us going that route, that we will end up there at some point politically, that will be pushed towards legalization. But I will say this, I think the other law enforcement agencies that I've talked to in Colorado and some other states that have put their foot down and really said, no way, never, we're not going to allow this kind of thing, have shot themselves in the foot too. Because what you have to realize is that we don't have control over whether it comes to the state or not. And if it does, as law enforcement, my opinion is we have to figure out how to deal with it when it does come. And what do we do with that? And how do we work with the system and what's in there? Because one of the things the Colorado prosecutors and law enforcement told us, we met with them. They said when we started having discussions, one of the groups that was not in the room was the marijuana lobby. And so we weren't getting that other perspective on, what's going on and that kind of thing. And so we've really kind of had some discussions about how do we work, not with them to get it done, but how do we work within the bounds of what's going to happen and what that legislation looks like? Because they're a very powerful lobby. They've got more money than anybody when it comes to trying to get this pushed through and legalized. And then when you look at the tax dollars that a lot of states want out of it, being able to tax it and do that kind of thing, I think it will eventually make it here. I really do. Probably within the next 4 to 5 years, if not before. So we're really trying to figure out how to deal with that. That's why a lot of the DRE program, I've worked since I got in the DWI unit to build up that program, knowing that drug driving is on the rise. We're probably not going to stop that by any means, especially with all the stuff coming in and that we just can't slow down. And so how do we deal with that on the driving issue? I will also say this, I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum of legalization or not. There's arguments on both sides. I understand that. That's not my job to do anything with that, other than what we have seen is the driving issue on it is a problem. And so if you sit in your house and you do your thing, knock yourself out. But the minute you get in the car, you've now taken everybody else's life into your hands. And I think that having done this as long as I have, that's where the true fear that I have for the whole thing is that in DWI enforcement, you have people that the only thing they did was the person that got hit or killed a lot of times. The only thing they did was drive on the road and just going to and from wherever they were going when they get hit by somebody that's intoxicated. And I've seen too many lives and too many families completely decimated over a decision that somebody else made. And that's what you really, really see the heartache from. And that's what concerns me a lot with this kind of thing. And in the legalization, again, I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum, but I do worry about where we fall on the spectrum of crash and those kind of things. And I don't know. We'll see where we end up. But I hope that answers your question. I think we will probably be legalized here in Texas sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you so much, Detective Jennings. This was an awesome presentation, and we appreciate you taking the time to present today to our employers. We also thank everyone that attended today. If you have some follow-up questions, you can email Officer Jennings directly, or you can email me at deanne.crane@nsc.org, and I'll get those questions answered for you. I have put in the chat, you'll see the webinar evaluation link. If you'll take just a quick minute, there's 5 questions to answer. That will help us with future webinars and resources. You can make comments about today's webinar, and like I said, so with that, as you log off, if you will take the evaluation, I'll be sending a follow-up email to each of you with the presentation and some additional resources and things like that. And if there's nothing else that anybody has any questions on, we'll wrap up for today. We thank you all for attending. Be safe on the roadways and have a happy holiday. Thank you. And that
appreciate your time. Appreciate you.